When we finally arrived at the front of the house, Don Juan hooked the lantern on a beam and made me sit with my back against the wall. He sat to my right. "We're going to sit here," he said, "and you are going to write and talk to me in a very normal manner. The moth that lurched at you today is around in the bushes. After a while it'll come closer to look at you. That's why I've put the lantern on a beam right above you. The light will guide the moth to find you. When it gets to the edge of the bushes, it will call you. It is a very special sound. The sound by itself may help you." "What kind of a sound is it, Don Juan?" "It is a song, a haunting call that moths produce. Ordinarily it cannot be heard, but the moth out there in the bushes is a rare moth. You will hear its call clearly, and providing that you are impeccable, it will remain with you for the rest of your life." "What is it going to help me with?" "Tonight, you're going to try to finish what you started earlier. Seeing happens only when the warrior is capable of stopping the internal dialogue. Today, you stopped your talk at will out there in the bushes, and you saw. What you saw was not clear. You thought that it was a man. I say it was a moth. Neither of us is correct. But that's because we have to talk. I still have the upper hand because I see better than you and because I'm familiar with the sorcerer's explanation, so I know, although it's not altogether accurate, that the shape you saw tonight was a moth, and now you're going to remain silent and thoughtless and let that little moth come to you again." I could hardly take notes. Don Juan laughed and urged me to keep on writing as if nothing bothered me. He touched my arm and said that writing was the best protective shield that I had. "We've never talked about moths," he went on. "The time was not right until now. As you already know, your spirit was unbalanced. To counteract that, I taught you to live the warrior's way. Well, a warrior starts off with the certainty that his spirit is off balance, then by living in full control and awareness, but without hurry or compulsion, he does his ultimate best to gain this balance. In your case, as in the case of every man, your imbalance was due to the sum total of all your actions, but now your spirit seems to be in the proper light to talk about moths." "How did you know that this was the right time to talk about moths?" "I caught a glimpse of the moth prowling around when you arrived. It was the first time it was friendly and open. I had seen it before in the mountains around Genaro's house, but only as a menacing figure reflecting your lack of order." I heard a strange sound at that moment. It was like a muffled creaking of a branch rubbing against another, or like the sputtering of a small motor heard from a distance. It changed scales, like a musical tone, creating an eerie rhythm. Then it stopped. "That was the moth," Don Juan said. "Perhaps you've already noticed that although the light of the lantern is bright enough to attract moths, there isn't a single one flying around it." I hadn't paid attention to it, but once Don Juan made me aware of it, I also noticed an incredible silence in the desert around the house. "Don't get jumpy," he said calmly. "There is nothing in this world that a warrior cannot account for. You see, a warrior considers himself already dead, so there is nothing for him to lose. The worst has already happened to him, therefore he's clear and calm. Judging him by his acts or by his words, one would never suspect that he has witnessed everything." Don Juan's words, and above all his mood, were very soothing to me. I told him that in my day-to-day life I no longer experienced the obsessive fear I used to, but that my body entered into convulsions of fright at the thought of what was out there in the dark. "Out there is only knowledge," he said in a factual tone. "Knowledge is frightening, true, But if a warrior accepts the frightening nature of knowledge, he cancels out its awesomeness. The strange, sputtering noise happened again. It seemed closer and louder. I listened carefully. The more attention I paid to it, the more difficult it was to determine its nature. It didn't seem to be the call of a bird or the cry of a land animal. The tone of each sputter was rich and deep. Some were produced in a low key, others in a high one. They had a rhythm and a specific duration. Some were long. I heard them like a single unit of sound. Others were short and happened in a cluster, like the staccato sound of a machine gun. The moths are the heralds, or better yet, the guardians of eternity, Don Juan said after the sound had stopped. For some reason, or for no reason at all, they are the depositories of the gold dust of eternity. The metaphor was foreign to me. I asked him to explain it. The moths carry a dust on their wings, he said, a dark gold dust. That dust is the dust of knowledge. His explanation had made the metaphor even more obscure. I vacillated for a moment trying to find the best way of wording my question, but he began to talk again. Knowledge is a most peculiar affair, he said, especially for a warrior. Knowledge for a warrior is something that comes at once, engulfs him, and passes on. What does knowledge have to do with the dust on the wings of moths? I asked after a long pause. Knowledge comes floating, like specks of gold dust, the same dust that covers the wings of moths. So for a warrior, knowledge is like taking a shower or being rained on by specks of dark gold dust. In the most polite manner I was capable of, I mentioned that his explanations had confused me even more. He laughed and assured me that he was making perfect sense, except that my reason wouldn't allow me to be at ease. The moths have been the intimate friends and helpers of sorcerers from time immemorial, he said. I had not touched upon this subject before because of your lack of preparation. But how can the dust on their wings be knowledge? You'll see. He put his hand over my notebook and told me to close my eyes and become silent and without thoughts. He said that the call of the moth in the chaparral was going to aid me. If I paid attention to it, it would tell me of imminent events. He stressed that he didn't know how the communication between the moth and myself was going to be established, neither did he know what the terms of the communication would be. He urged me to feel at ease and confident and trust my personal power. After an initial period of impatience and nervousness, I succeeded in becoming silent. My thoughts diminished in number until my mind was perfectly blank. The noises of the desert chaparral seemed to have been turned on as I became more calm. The strange sound that Don Juan said was made by a moth occurred again. It registered as a feeling in my body and not as a thought in my mind. It occurred to me that it wasn't threatening or malevolent at all. It was sweet and simple. It was like a child's call. It brought back the memory of a little boy that I once knew. The long sounds reminded me of his round blonde head, the short staccato sounds of his laughter. The most anguishing feeling oppressed me, and yet there were no thoughts in my mind. I felt the anguish in my body. I could no longer remain sitting and slid to the floor on my side. My sadness was so intense that I began to think. I assessed my pain and sorrow and suddenly found myself in the midst of an internal debate about the little boy. The sputtering sound had ceased. My eyes were closed. I heard Don Juan standing up, and then I felt him helping me to sit up. I didn't want to speak. He didn't say a word. I heard him moving by me. I opened my eyes. He had knelt in front of me and was examining my face, holding the lantern close to me. He ordered me to put my hands over my stomach. He stood up, went to the kitchen, and brought me some water. He splashed some on my face and gave me the rest to drink. He sat down next to me and handed me my notes. I told him that the sound had involved me in the most painful reverie. "You are indulging beyond your limits," he said dryly. He seemed to immerse himself in thought, as if he were searching for an appropriate suggestion to make. "The problem for tonight is seeing people," he finally said. "First, you must stop your internal dialogue. Then you must bring up the image of the person that you want to see. Any thought that one holds in mind in a state of silence is properly a command, since there are no other thoughts to compete with it. Tonight, the moth in the bushes wants to help you, so it will sing for you. Its song will bring the golden specks, and then you will see the person you've selected." I wanted to have more details, but he made an abrupt gesture and signaled me to proceed. After struggling for a few minutes to stop my internal dialogue, I was thoroughly silent. And then I deliberately held the brief thought of a friend of mine. I kept my eyes closed for what I believed to be just an instant, and then I became aware that someone was shaking me by the shoulders. It was a slow realization. I opened my eyes and found myself lying on my left side. I had apparently fallen asleep so deeply that I did not remember having slumped to the ground. Don Juan helped me to sit up again. He was laughing. He imitated my snoring and said that if he hadn't witnessed it himself, he would not believe that anyone could fall asleep so fast. He said that it was a treat for him to be around me whenever I had to do something that my reason didn't understand. He pushed my notebook away from me and said that we had to start all over. I followed the necessary steps. The strange, sputtering sound happened again. This time, however, it didn't come from the chaparral. Rather, it seemed to happen inside of me, as if my lips or legs or arms were producing it. The sound soon engulfed me. I felt like soft balls were being sputtered out from or against me. It was a soothing, exquisite feeling of being bombarded by heavy cotton puffs. Suddenly, I heard a door blown open by a gust of wind, and I was thinking again. I thought that I had ruined another chance. I opened my eyes and found myself in my room. The objects on my desk were as I had left them. The door was open. There was a strong wind outside. The thought crossed my mind that I should check the water heater. I then heard a rattling on the sliding windows that I had put up myself and which didn't fit well on the window frame. It was a furious rattling, as if someone wanted to enter. I experienced a jolt of fright. I stood up from my chair. I felt something pulling me. I screamed. Don Juan was shaking me by the shoulders. I excitedly gave him an account of my vision. It had been so vivid that I was shivering. I felt that I had just been at my desk in my full corporeal form. Don Juan shook his head in disbelief and said that I was a genius in tricking myself. He didn't seem impressed by what I had done. He discarded it flatly and ordered me to start again. I then heard the mysterious sound again. It came to me as Don Juan had suggested in the form of a rain of golden specks. I didn't feel that they were flat specks or flakes, as he had described them, but rather spherical bubbles. They floated towards me. One of them burst open and revealed a scene to me. It was as if it had stopped in front of my eyes and opened up, disclosing a strange object. It looked like a mushroom. I was definitely looking at it, and what I was experiencing was not a dream. The mushroom-like object remained unchanged within my field of vision, and then it popped, as though the light that was shining on it had been turned off. An interminable darkness followed it. I felt a tremor, a very unsettling jolt, and then I had the abrupt realization that I was being shaken. All at once my senses were turned on. Don Juan was shaking me vigorously, and I was looking at him. I must have just opened my eyes at that moment. He sprinkled water on my face. The coldness of the water was very appealing. After a moment's pause, he wanted to know what had happened. I recounted every detail of my vision. "But what did I see?" I asked. "Your friend," he retorted. I laughed and patiently explained that I had seen a mushroom-like figure. Although I had no criteria to judge dimensions, I had had the feeling that it was about a foot long. Don Juan emphasized that feeling was all that counted. He said that my feelings were the gauge that assessed the state of being of the subject that I was seeing. "From your description and your feelings, I must conclude that your friend must be a very fine man," he said. I was baffled by his words. He said that the mushroom-like formation was the essential shape of human beings when a sorcerer was seeing them from far away, but when a sorcerer was directly facing the person he was seeing, the human quality was shown as an egg-like cluster of luminous fibers. "You were not facing your friend," he said. "Therefore he appeared like a mushroom." "Why is that so, Don Juan?" "No one knows. That simply is the way men appear in this specific type of seeing." He added that every feature of the mushroom-like formation had a special significance, but that it was impossible for a beginner to accurately interpret that significance. I then had an intriguing recollection. Some years before, in a state of non-ordinary reality elicited by the intake of psychotropic plants, I had experienced or perceived, while I was looking at a water stream, that a cluster of bubbles floated towards me, engulfing me. The golden bubbles I had just envisioned had floated and engulfed me in exactly the same manner. In fact, I could say that both clusters had had the same structure and the same pattern. Don Juan listened to my commentaries without interest. "Don't waste your power on trifles," he said. "You are dealing with that immensity, out there." He pointed toward the chaparral with a movement of his hand. "To turn that magnificence out there into reasonableness doesn't do anything for you. Here, surrounding us, is eternity itself. To engage in reducing it to a manageable nonsense is petty and outright disastrous." He then insisted that I should attempt to see another person from my realm of acquaintances. He added that once the vision had terminated, I should strive to open my eyes by myself and surface to the full awareness of my immediate surroundings. I succeeded in holding the view of another mushroom-like form, but while the first one had been yellowish and small, the second one was whitish, larger, and contorted. By the time we had finished talking about the two shapes I had seen, I had forgotten the moth in the bushes, which had been so overwhelming a little while before. I told Don Juan that it amazed me that I had such a facility for discarding something so truly uncanny. It was as if I were not the person I knew myself to be. "I don't see why you make such a fuss out of this," Don Juan said. "Whenever the dialogue stops, the world collapses and extraordinary facets of ourselves surface, as though they had been kept heavily guarded by our words. You are like you are because you tell yourself that you are that way." After a short rest, Don Juan urged me to continue calling friends. He said that the point was to attempt to see as many times as possible in order to establish a guideline for feeling. I called 32 persons in succession. After each attempt, he demanded a careful and detailed rendition of everything I had perceived in my vision. He changed that procedure, however, as I became more proficient in my performance, judging by my stopping the internal dialogue in a matter of seconds, by my being capable of opening my eyes by myself at the end of each experience, and by my resuming ordinary activities without any transition. I noticed this change while we were discussing the coloration of the mushroom-like formations. He had already made the point that what I called coloration was not a hue, but a glow of different intensities. I was about to describe a yellowish glow that I had envisioned when he interrupted me and accurately described what I had seen. From that point on, he discussed the content of each vision, not as if he had understood what I had said, but as if he had seen it himself. When I called him to comment on it, he flatly refused to talk about it. By the time I had finished calling the 32 persons, I had realized that I had seen a variety of mushroom-like shapes and glows, and I had had a variety of feelings towards them, ranging from mild delight to sheer disgust. Don Juan explained that men were filled with configurations that could be wishes, problems, sorrows, worries, and so on. He asserted that only a profoundly powerful sorcerer could untangle the meaning of those configurations, and that I had to be content with viewing only the general shape of men. I was very tired. There was something indeed fatiguing about those strange shapes. My overall sensation was one of queasiness. I hadn't liked them. They had made me feel trapped and doomed. Don Juan commanded me to write in order to dispel the sensation of somberness. And after a long, silent interval during which I couldn't write anything, he asked me to call on people that he himself would select. A new series of forms emerged. They were not mushroom-like, but looked more like Japanese cups for sake turned upside down. Some of them had a head-like formation, just like the foot of sake cups. Others were more round. Their shapes were appealing and peaceful. I sensed that there was some inherent feeling of happiness about them. They bounced, as opposed to the earth-bound heaviness that the previous batch had exhibited. Somehow, the mere fact that they were there eased my fatigue. Among the persons he had selected was his apprentice, Eligio. When I summoned the vision of Eligio, I got a jolt that shook me out of my visionary state. Eligio had a long, white shape that jerked and seemed to leap at me. Don Juan explained that Eligio was a very talented apprentice, and that he, no doubt, had noticed that someone was seeing him. Another of Don Juan's selections was Pablito, Don Genaro's apprentice. The jolt that the vision of Pablito gave me was even greater than Eligio's. Don Juan laughed so hard that tears rolled down his cheeks. "Why are those people shaped differently?" I asked. "They have more personal power," he replied. "As you might have noticed, they are not pegged down to the ground." What has given them that lightness? Were they born that way? "We all are born that light and bouncy, but we become earthbound and fixed. We make ourselves that way. So perhaps we may say that these people are shaped differently because they live like warriors. That's not important, though. What's of value is that you are at the edge now. You've called 47 people, and there is only one more left in order for you to complete the original 48. I remembered at that moment that years before he had told me, while discussing corn sorcery and divination, that the number of corn kernels that a sorcerer possessed was 48. He had never explained why. I asked him again, "Why 48? 48 is our number," he said. "That's what makes us men. I don't know why. Don't waste your power in idiotic questions." He stood up and stretched his arms and legs. He told me to do the same. I noticed that there was a tinge of light in the sky toward the east. We sat down again. He leaned over and put his mouth to my ear. "The last person you're going to call is Genaro, the real McCoy.